Joining me today for the interview is Dr. Leanne Jung. Leanne is the CEO of Lead Inclusion. She is a clinical professor at San Diego State University, and she is a consultant to schools around the world. She provides support to schools in the areas of universal design for learning. That's going to be our topic today, but also inclusion, intervention, mastery-based assessment, and grading. And before beginning her career in higher education, Leanne worked in special education as both a teacher and administrator. Leanne has authored 6 books and more than 50 journal articles and book chapters. So I'm really excited to have someone here who I consider a dear friend, but also an educator for whom I could not have more respect for. So Leanne, love having you here. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for having me. Glad to be here today.
It's great to have you here. I was just thinking before we got started that the last time we hung out was the Ear Coast Conference in Malaysia in 2019. So it's been a while since we've been able to hang out. So this is a good excuse for us to have a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to
Right. Okay, so we're going to dig into UDL, and listeners will recall that back in January I had Katie Novak on my podcast talking about UDL. But today, Leanne and I are going to focus on the assessment side of UDL and really dig into that sort of concept. So let's begin with the foundation of our conversation today, UDL. So let me set the scene. You're at a conference, and of course, the conference will be post-COVID. You're at a conference. It's the end of the day. You get into the hotel elevator. In walks somebody who's not attending the conference. They get into the elevator. They push the number 4. They're going up 4 floors. They turn and look at you, and they see your badge, and it says UDL. And they say to you, UDL, what's that? And you have 4 floors to tell them. How do you answer them?
So universal design for learning is a lot like the curb cuts that we see around us in our environment. We see these ramps that go from the sidewalks to the streets. And those sidewalk curb cuts, they're necessary for people who use wheelchairs. People who use wheelchairs, they can't get around town without these curb cuts. But those curb cuts also help parents who are pushing strollers. They help delivery people who are carrying carts. They help people who are using roller skates, really anything with wheels. And we can think of all kinds of other scenarios where those curb cuts help people, not just those who use wheelchairs. And universal design for learning in our classrooms are like the curb cuts. It's all of those things that we maybe once reserved for special education, but we're bringing them into our everyday classroom so they help not only students who have IEPs, but they help lots of other students too.
I love that idea of curb cuts. I think it's such a great visual and makes so much sense. And it's so interesting how so many of the things that are helpful to support learners who need it are helpful to all learners, and that there are aspects that we often think about. Why do you think that we have this tendency to silo support or silo, the way that we design our instruction? This is for everybody and this is for those who need it. Why do we seem to have this habit? I don't know how ubiquitous that habit is, but it's enough to notice that we seem to always compartmentalize instead of expanding. Why do you think that happens?
I think some of it comes from a place of the field somewhat emerging separately. So, in the 70s, when in the United States, the field of special education really took off. In many ways, it developed its own literature base, its own set of methods. If you look at colleges and universities, the departments of special education are separate from the departments of curriculum and instruction often. And so here we've prepared educators separately. And often when we go into schools and you ask a principal about what's going on with special education or how data are used or how intervention is delivered, they'll often direct you immediately to the special ed coordinator. And the same happens if we talk to teachers, talk to the special educator. And it's not from a place of not wanting to serve all students, and it's not from a place of not wanting to, not caring for all students. I think sometimes it comes from a place of feeling I don't have the expertise. I feel this person has the expertise. And so sometimes we hear things like, design this accommodation or design a modification please, for my student. And it's, or take the student and deliver an intervention, take the student out of the classroom. And many times these requests are coming from a place of, I'm not sure what to do.
Yeah.
And
I think that's an interesting observation, because I think that it would not be my intent to suggest that the siloing of these topics is necessarily cynical, but yeah, I think you're onto something there when it comes to the notion of hesitancy. You know, teachers want to do right by students, and they hesitate for the right reasons, and therefore look to experts to help guide the decisions they make. So before we dig into the assessment side of UDL, what do you think are some of the most common misunderstandings of UDL, and how can we proactively prevent those misunderstandings from emerging in the first place?
You know, I think the most common misunderstanding is related to what you just had to say about kind of the siloed approach to services sometimes, and that is, people sometimes think of universal design for learning as being a special education solution, as being a solution to support those students who have labels, who have ILPs or IEPs, rather than this is a general education solution. This is something for all students. How do we prevent that from being a misunderstanding? I think there are a number of ways maybe to tackle that. I know you conduct a lot of professional learning experiences and courses, and I do as well. And sometimes we see the population of people attending the professional learning for UDL is all special educators, or it's all people who are serving students who have IEPs, or reading specialists or speech therapists or so forth. And the information and the support and the coaching and so forth has to be a whole school effort rather than an effort aimed directly at the specialists.
Yeah. Do you then see then that for principals and even district leaders, it is, important to be purposeful about who has access to those trainings at sort of the first instance? I think sometimes principals might think to themselves, well, if I send my special education staff, or if I send my student services staff, there'll be a kind of trickle down support that happens to the general education staff, and that can happen, but I'm not sure it always happens. So I wonder if one of the answers might be for principals and superintendents and directors to give another thought about who attends those events and who has the first interface with the professional learning experience. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, exactly. And if it's a team effort to implement UDL, then sending teams of people rather than one part of the team and expecting them to speak for everyone and to process it for everyone. UDL assumes that everyone on the team has expertise. Everyone in the building has expertise. New teacher, seasoned teacher, special educator, classroom teacher, leader, counselor, everyone has expertise, something to contribute to the design. And so bringing them together to co-design and learn the process of co-designing is important. I think another linchpin of this is really understanding the false dichotomy of disability, meaning that really as a remnant of US law from the 1970s, people all over the world think about disability as something you either have or you don't. It's dichotomous. You've got it or you don't. And we've drawn these hard and fast lines, but those hard and fast lines that we draw are fake. They're not real. They exist because of old funding structures. We had to say who qualified for an IEP. Therefore, we have definitions of autism spectrum disorder, of intellectual disability, of specific learning disability, and you either have it or you don't. But that's not the way that needs work. That's the way that labels work. It's the way that rights work. So if you have the label, you have special needs. But students who have labels don't necessarily have special needs. For every student who qualifies and has a label of learning disability, there are more students who didn't quite qualify, but have the exact same need.
Right.
There are numerous students who have trouble learning to read. Some of those have a neurological explanation for that. They have
Mhm.
a specific learning disability, they have dyslexia. But many students, most students who are having difficulty learning to read don't have dyslexia. They don't have a neurological explanation. There's something else.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned that because I remember, years ago, just working in schools where, the one of the most challenging groups to support, and we did everything we could. We thought, I mean, we probably would do a more effective job today, knowing what we know about UDL, but it was those students who didn't quite qualify. They fell short. And I remember those conversations. They don't technically qualify as learning disabled, but that doesn't change their situation or circumstance or their needs. And we had to, you have to scrape together, figuratively scrape together ways to support those students because the supplemental funding is not there and because the personnel is not there and because there are so many rules around that. I think that's such an important point to think about the funding structures and the model for that. And it is a challenge. It is a challenge for schools and a challenge to support students. And it seems to me that that UDL is an answer for that, about how we can, again, expand the kind of support that's available to students.
It really is. And unfortunately, in 2004, with the reauthorization in the US of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act,
Mhm.
this idea of RTI, MTSS, of a tiered approach to serving students based on their needs, not their labels,
Right.
entered the picture. And
Right.
so there have been some doors opened for us with that.
Yeah, I think that was a real pivotal moment in terms of because, like you say, I think it brought the notion of needs to the masses, and now it became a needs-driven framework as opposed to a funding-driven. I mean, the funding is still a part of the school system, and it is part of what happens as far as identification and labeling. But the focus of and the energy of the school is more around support and needs and all of that. I love that pivot point. So, from your perspective, is UDL an important key to creating real equity and inclusion in schools? Is that where UDL can really sort of show its strength? Is how we create these inclusive, equitable kinds of cultures?
Absolutely. As we think about a tiered approach to services, as schools take on MTSS and RTII or RTI squared, a lot of times the effort gets focused in the intervention and how we'll take data and deliver intervention. And certainly those are essential components of a tiered approach to services or tiered approach to instruction and intervention. But the first tier of that tiered approach is universal design for learning. It is the
Right.
universal tier. It's what everyone gets. And without intentional effort to the universal tier to bring equity to the universal tier, none of the rest of a tiered approach can be built upon it. None of the rest works
Mhm.
because if we don't have a solid use of UDL in our tier 1 instruction, then we're going to be just really working so hard to provide intervention to numerous students who could have been effectively served within the universal tier and never needed intervention. So
Yeah.
it's trying to push more of that to the front end and make it an integral part of our day-to-day design so that we need less special accommodations and modifications.
It's something that I know you talk about and I talk about with schools on a weekly basis, which is, each tier is subsequently more labor intensive. And so the payoff is investing in those tier 1 support structures, universal systems, whether they be on a behavioral side of the ledger or the academic side of the ledger. And we know that's just a construct because we're dealing with a whole child. But the point is that I think sometimes schools, instead of spending so much time talking about their intervention structures before making sure that tier 1 is in place, because when you figuratively pull kids down the framework or the structure of the pyramid, you have more time because the minutes are the minutes, and you have more time for tier 2 and tier 3 interventions if you invest in those universal interventions. And to me, it seems UDL is that perfect way to at least try to catch figuratively again, catch as many students as you can effectively the first time, rather than having to react to where they are. So it's definitely yeah.
That's well articulated. That's,
Thank you.
you're getting return on your investment if you
Right. Yeah, I
invest.
just find that people want to jump to tier 2 or they want to jump to tier
Mhm.
3, and each of those tiers is a lot more involved, a lot more work. There's a lot more monitoring. It's just a frequency issue and an efficiency issue, and therefore, as you said, when you are ineffective at, if our tier 1 is not maximizing its effectiveness, then you figuratively push kids up the triangle or the pyramid, if you will, and now
Exactly.
you have the volume in tier 2 that
Mhm.
schools don't have the capacity necessarily to even support.
Exactly.
So yeah,
If you have half of the students needing a tier 2 or tier 3 level of intervention, you've got a tier 1 challenge to solve, not a tier 2 or
exactly.
tier 3 challenge to solve.
Exactly. And I've heard that for years, and I know you have as well, which is, oh, Tom, you don't understand, 15-20% of our kids are in tier 3, and right away that's a tier 1 issue for sure, because it's just, it really shouldn't play out that way in most school contexts. So I know that listeners thinking about UDL, I can hear many of them sort of thinking, and I've actually heard some folks say this to me as well. Okay, Tom, or Leanne, I get it. Multiple pathways, multiple means for students to demonstrate their learning. I get that. How in the world do I assess that with all of these different ways and all of these different means? So let's look at assessment in UDL from a tight and loose perspective. Okay,
Okay.
so when it comes to assessment, what within the UDL framework, what needs to be tight, and what can we be loose about?
Right, right. Well, UDL is all about being loose. It's all about finding the places where you can offer choice and really and give students options for how they show what they've learned the best, how they can shine. But it doesn't mean we're completely loose. We have to be tight, as you say, on what it is we're trying to measure or what it is we're trying to teach. So we have to know what it is we're teaching. This piece involves that we distinguish what it is we're measuring, the construct we're measuring, from the task.
Mhm.
And the task is what we can be loose on. The construct, what it is we're trying to teach, is what we're tight on. So we want to make sure we're measuring something that matters. We want to make sure we've chosen, standards and skills and understandings that are transferable, that are life-changing, that are gateways, that keep
Mhm.
doors open for kids. And we want to focus a lot of effort on teaching those skills and measuring those. But let's take for example, supporting a claim with evidence. So that's a skill that a lot of teachers are working on with their students, is how to make a claim and evaluate the relative sources of evidence, make a judgment on that, and support your claim with evidence. And it may be that any given teacher may have assigned a research paper in the past for this. This is how you're going to show me you've gained that skill. But that's only one of an infinite number of ways that students can show that they've gained that skill. So what are we tight on? Whatever our requirements are for students showing that they have the ability to support a claim with evidence, whether it's, however many sources you want them to bring in, what types of sources you want them to bring in, how you want them to integrate it, how you want them to present this, all of that is tight. But whether it's done through Zoom, whether it's done live, whether it's done as a presentation, whether it's done as a traditional research paper or a debate or a mock newscast or
Right.
on and on and on, all of the ways students can show that can be flexible. And this isn't just about students' preferences. It's not just about make sure students are interested and engaged. Those are important components, but this is truly about equity.
Mhm.
If we think about the ways that any of us can engage with a group and teach, we all have preferences. But sometimes those ways of showing, those ways of teaching are not only not our preferred way, but they can get in the way of our being able to perform well. So I've seen you present adeptly in front of thousands of people. You have no problem with this, right? Like you're fine with this. You shine in that way. You're able to clearly articulate and guide a group. But for some people, speaking in front of 5,000 people would absolutely impact their performance. Would it make them less of an expert, less knowledgeable in their area, within their craft? Not at all. It just means that way, if we were to assess them in that way, would not be a valid way to assess their performance. So if everybody had to present what they knew in front of 5,000 people, or if that's not intimidating, then on live television to an international audience, if we assessed everyone in that way, there's a clear advantage to those who are not affected by that way of performing. For those who are affected, though, it creates an inequity. And so within our schools, that's exactly what we're doing when we say everyone has to do it this way.
Right.
For those whose performance on the skill is affected by this way of showing what they know, they are at a clear disadvantage. And within our grading environment, they're harmed. So there are inequities introduced in this way.
Yeah. How do you, when you work with teachers, how do you help them understand the separation? Because I think sometimes, and not everyone, but many teachers will sort of look at, here's what the learning goal is, therefore that's how I have to assess it, or that's how I have to elicit the evidence of learning. So there's an attachment to, as you say, claim evidence reasoning, therefore that must be in written form. How do we detach that? What are some of the specific ways teachers can think about trying to separate the learning goal or the outcome or the standard from the assessment method?
Yeah, so normally I first take teachers through exactly what we just did, is to think about the ways that you perform best, and think about the ways that affect you. And then we think about specific students. We think about specific examples of student work. Let's think through the students in the past who knew it. They had the skill, but they bombed that final.
Mm-hmm.
What are the external threats to the validity of that measure? What are the outside factors other than they didn't know it that could have gotten in the way? And for many of those students, it's because it was high stakes. It's because it was a final that was going to count a certain percentage of the final grade. It was because I don't show what I know well on a multiple choice test. Like it's the format. Every teacher can relate to either having personally experienced this or having had students where they knew it. Mm-hmm. And yet the assessment didn't reflect it. And when you go on this journey and say, and ask the question, in what format would that student have been able to show you? And we can always find a format where that student is able to show. One of the pieces here too that's important, it's not only separating task from skill or understanding, it's also understanding that formality is not an indicator of validity. Meaning I can have an informal conversation with a student, and if I'm able to elicit their best performance and they can tell me what they know easily one-on-one in a conversation, but they can't show it on a test as well, that conversation was more valid, even though it was less formal.
Right. And I 100% subscribe to that. I think the worry that I hear from teachers, and I'd be interested in your response, the worry that teachers have when a student answers orally, informally, et cetera, is how do I track that? How do I, it's not tangible. So if I get challenged by a parent, or if I get questioned by my principal about, well, where's the evidence that you say this student is less than proficient, or, they're developing or approaching? How do you guide teachers in thinking about that aspect of assessment?
Absolutely. We still need to have rubrics. We still have measures. We still have criteria, but those criteria are task agnostic, if you will.
Right.
So we still have criteria for how this performance looks, but we take out all of the requirements of how many pages it should be and how many references, or how many references might be a criteria, but exactly, the format of those references, all of those pieces that make it specific to a writing task are removed then from our rubric and our criteria
Right.
there.
Right. I love that term. The term I often use is task neutral, but I love the term task agnostic. I think that's it sounds more academic. I like that. I want to come back to assessment and performance assessment momentarily, but I want to pivot here a little bit to formative assessment, because another source of tension I hear from teachers as we sort of talk about this, progression and UDL and expansive opportunities, is this notion that if students are on multiple pathways, okay, so Tom, I get it. We're all headed to the same destination, but if the pathways diverge and we're all on different pathways, how in the world do I manage formative assessment? So from your perspective, Leanne, what are the most efficient and effective ways for teachers to, again, for lack of a better word, to manage the sort of formative assessment work on the assessment for learning strategies if students are along multiple pathways toward proficiency?
Honestly, multiple pathways it is true that they're using multiple ways to engage with content and express what they know and are able to do and understand, but they still are all on the same pathway. Our feedback largely is organized in the same way. The way that we track student progress, largely in the same way, as long as our rubrics and our criteria are removing the requirements of the task. So in terms of just managing this almost from a bookkeeping standpoint, of keeping track of this in a grade book, we can still do that. And in terms of managing, how we're guiding students, it really is in the same way, just with the lens of different means of showing what they know.
It's the looseness of opportunity, but it seems that I think the misunderstanding sometimes emerges when we're not purposeful about certain steps along the way, the benchmarks, the learning progression, how we get to criteria, the rubrics, all of that. I think you've articulated that incredibly well, which is we still have to be very focused on what we're learning, what the students are learning, what we're measuring, and create the opportunities for students around that, but still stay focused on that pathway. And I think the misunderstanding often comes from this notion of this expansive view of learning feels like the Wild West, where the students can just do whatever they feel like doing, as opposed to being very intentional about the learning opportunities. Would that be a fair sort of assertion, that sometimes that misunderstanding is that it's just this loose kind of do what you want kind of approach, and that's not really the case? Yeah.
Absolutely. There's nothing about the learning progressions that changed, or the nature of our feedback, or the nature of even keeping track of this. The looseness is simply in the method in which students interact and act and express.
Right. Now, it seems to me that coming back to sort of the end point, if you will, the expansiveness of UDL seems to create more opportunities naturally to encourage authentic, relevant performance assessment, performance tasks, et cetera. So what for you are the key aspects that teachers should think about when they're trying to design performance tasks or performance assessments that actually rise to the level of the promise of UDL? Because, the reason I ask the question is a lot of times teachers will design what they call performance tasks, but they really are superficial. They aren't getting to the deeper understanding. So for you, what are some of the keys that teachers need to think about when designing those authentic assessments?
Right. Well, having your learning progression, knowing what your target is up front, and making sure you're completely focused on that, of course, is number one in any assessment design. But not giving choice for giving choice of ways that students can show what they know by itself is engaging, but in giving those choices, to be thinking about what are the confounding variables. What are the pieces that are getting in the way of my being able to measure with validity what students know and are able to do? So if I take a look at that final exam, that I normally gave, and I see that, for a lot of students, the confounding variable is being timed. It's multiple choice. Or in this research paper, the confounding variable for many of my students is writing, that they can express themselves better verbally. It's on purpose, thinking through what got in the way of your students being able to show what they know and offering options that respond to that.
Yeah.
So offering options that are intentionally removing what we would call the confounding variables. So if you're trying to measure a student's skills in science, but the way that you've tested is getting in the way of their showing what they know, that's a confounding variable that your test or your assessment has introduced. So that would be an important component.
Right. So would it be, would a process for that for a teacher maybe be, okay, what is the standard, or what are the standards I'm assessing? And does that standard sort of dictate or drive the method? For example, writing standards, right? There's in many cases not as many opportunities to expand the format because students are writing, because it is a writing standard. So are my choices getting in the way of my ability to know deeply what the student understands? Is that something that we should think about? That teachers should think about? Is there a connection between my method and the standard? And if not, what are the other opportunities that can help mitigate those confounding factors?
Right. Yeah. Exactly, Tom. And even when you're assessing writing, yes, you are limited to expressing via writing, but all of the other options are available. It doesn't have to be a 5-paragraph essay. No author out there writes a 5-paragraph essay. There are an infinite number of ways to write. If students enjoy getting creative, if they enjoy technology, if they enjoy a more formal versus informal style, there are so many options, even within the confounds that I have to show writing, that there are still an infinite number of options. That's the only piece that is fixed. Everything else is flexed.
Right. So it narrows the choices, but we certainly still have, and I think this is where, for a lot of folks, it's the difference between the method and the format. And I think for many of us, we conflate the two, and we think, well, it's a constructed response. It lends itself to that. It's a writing standard. Therefore, they have to do it in this very narrow way. And I think what you're suggesting is, and I would subscribe to this, is the idea that within that method, there are many different formats that writing could take on. And yes, I haven't written a 5-paragraph essay since maybe freshman year of university, or I don't know. The last time I did that was my Lord of the Flies essay from 10th grade. I don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you can find students who enjoy blogging or enjoy, engaging in a more informal, maybe in a way that's more relevant to their current life and their current experiences and their current culture. And, all of these pieces can be taken into account when we're giving ideas for choices and asking students, what are their ideas? Mentoring them. They'll come up with better ideas than we will of how they can show what they know.
What about the teacher that's maybe overwhelmed? They think to themselves, Leanne, I really want to offer these multiple opportunities for students, but I'm intimidated by that. I don't know. So I don't know how to manage that. I really have the desire. I have the willingness. I don't feel like I have the capacity. So how do you respond to a teacher who might say that to you?
Yeah, I mean, the UDL framework includes a lot of components, and that's a common response is, how do I implement all of this at one time? And even within the assessment piece, even with what we're talking about, I would suggest people pick one assignment, one project, one test, one task that they've given in the past or they're planning to give in the future, and think of one alternate. Give students 2 choices and see how that goes. see what you learn from that, see what your students learn from that, see what the implications are.
Right.
But take one piece and give two options.
So while it is a cliche, it is true when it comes to UDL. Think big, but start small,
Absolutely.
and ease your way into it. Okay, so let's finish up our conversation about UDL and focus now. Turn the lens around and focus on the students. It seems to me that UDL would be very conducive to creating more metacognitive opportunities for students and allowing students to be more self-regulatory about their learning. Am I right about that? And if so, what are some of the specifics that help us create that kind of context for students?
Yeah, I mean that's a big part of the purpose of universal design for learning. The whole principle of multiple means for engagement is all around helping to support learners to be more self-directed and be more self-regulated and have the skills to cope when the learning is hard, have skills um, to be motivated and to engage, to self-assess so that
Mhm.
they're, I mean, all of us who are talking about assessment are always, are always saying we need to do more assessment with students than to students. And this is a big part of why, is because by the time students get into college, they're going to have to assess their own learning. They're going to have to decide on their own with when they go see a professor for additional support or what they need to engage in more, how they direct their own learning. And so we need to, over time, be releasing more of that role to students and prepare them to be able to do so. So universal design for learning involves teaching students how to set their own goals, teaching students how to assess their own learning, being engaged in how they learn best, how they cope best, how they build persistence. And so each of the checkpoints within the universal design for learning framework um, offers a piece of building this self-regulation.
Yeah, it continues, I think, to be a source of tension for all educators, which is, we know that students being metacognitive is such an effective, not just an effective opportunity to be more self-regulatory, but it deepens their learning. And yet teachers always struggle to find the time and struggle to create those opportunities, right? I know it's important, but I struggle to find the time to create those opportunities. Do you have any suggestions for teachers as to how they can, again, sort of the under the idea of think big, start small, where might be an entry point for teachers to just begin bringing more metacognition, more self-regulation of learning into their classroom? Where are some of the points where they might be able to see some early success and realize the benefit and the value of that opportunity for students?
Yeah, I can understand how, saying we're going to carve time out to teach these skills might be overwhelming. But when we build routines
Mhm.
within our day, where students are used to, the routine that the teacher has established to pause and think in this way or reflect in this way, about their learning and what they need to build some awareness of, their own coping and their own strategies. um, yes, there's a little bit of an investment on the front end to teach some of the strategies explicitly and to teach the routine. But then once that's in place, it's very easy throughout the day to infuse these thinking and reflecting routines so that students are continually um, reflecting on their own learning and thinking about their own thinking and how they learn and grow best. Over time, the goal is that we're not needing to prompt that so much, but
Right.
investing that early on, not waiting until high school, but investing in early childhood.
Mhm.
I've seen beautiful examples of students who, walk up to a wall where there are examples of work and are able to say, this is where I am now, and this is what I'm working on next. And
Mhm.
that's our goal. We
Yeah.
want even tiny kids to know where they're going and to have some thoughts about how they learn and how they learn best and what they need from their environment and the people in their environment to be
Yeah.
successful.
It's all of those things. It's the empowerment, it's the agency, it's the self-regulation, it's the driving my own learning. And I think your point about, 12, 13 years later, or even longer, when students enter the university or college environment, and they are on their own more often. They go to class fewer hours a week. That level of advocacy and understanding of self, I think, is such a critical part of being successful at that next level.
I think during the pandemic, we realized that we have an opportunity,
Right.
because during the time of home learning, when students were not in an environment where we were regulating them all day and
Right.
and then they went home where we were with them portions of the day, but then they had to regulate their own learning and
Right.
manage their own time. We saw there were big gaps. So I
Yeah.
think it's apparent that that's a great opportunity we have to support students.
Yeah. What I can't give them their marching orders for 7 hours a day. What do we do? And that certainly, I think we've talked with many guests over the last year or so on the podcast about just the small silver linings that have come out of COVID. And certainly no one's happy that this has occurred, but we are learning some things about schools, about teaching, about learning, things that, what constitutes authentic evidence, how much evidence is necessary. What is it that we actually are asking students to do that is meaningful, deep, connected? So I think we have learned, I think we've learned a lot over the last year. So if we can, I think that's what we have to do as human beings, is just find those silver linings of these sort of unfortunate circumstances. And the pandemic could not be more unfortunate than what we're dealing with. It's changed society completely, and it has changed schools. So I think finding those silver linings is where we need to go. Now, listeners, I know Leanne probably won't mention it, so I'm going to mention it. Leanne, you are currently in the process of working on a book about UDL. So let's talk a little bit about that. Is that true?
I am. So I'm working on a book with Corwin Press on universal design for learning, and the focus is on building equity and on practical strategies for making this happen in all classrooms.
And that book will be available roughly when?
In the winter. Hopefully
in the winter. Okay, so stay tuned for that. Leanne, we're going to again. I always love talking to you. I've learned so much from you over the years about inclusion and support and special education, and just I think you're a tremendous wealth of knowledge. So I'm just going to use my respect and admiration for you to as an excuse to have you back on the podcast for sure. We're gonna do this again at some point, but right now we're gonna pivot a little bit. We've had a pretty serious discussion about UDL, so we're gonna have a little bit of fun here with a segment I call 3 questions, where I'm going to ask you 3 lighthearted questions so listeners can get to know Leanne a little bit more on a personal level, not just a professional level. Okay, so here we go. First one: what fictional character do you wish A, were real, and B, you had the opportunity to hang out with? Which fictional character do you wish were real and wish you had the opportunity to hang out with?
Okay, I'm gonna have to pause on that one, Tom. That's hard.
They're meant to be hard, but that's okay. Take your time. Take your time. Well, I can edit all of this out.
You can go to the next one. We can come back to that one.
We can even cut that one out.
These are going to be awful for me. This is hard.
Okay, no worries. Let me think of another one. What is your favorite album of all time? What do you love to listen to? What's that one album that?
Okay, I guess if I'm singing in my car to an old favorite album, it might be Janis Joplin.
Janis Joplin. Okay, yeah. It's I don't know what I expected, but I didn't see that coming. That's
I think that maybe that, yeah.
Got those old school.
Yeah. Or something from that era for sure.
Something from that era. Okay, second one. What is the one non-life-threatening thing that you have an irrational fear of?
Oh, that's easy. Oh, it's terrible. Roaches. I'm just terrified of roaches, and it's unfortunate because I like warm places. I like to travel to warm places, but yeah, that's and it's irrational. It's stand on a table and somebody else handle it. It's been embarrassing at times.
It is always interesting where you look at, whether it's a cockroach or a tiny little spider or
Yeah,
and we're up on the chair, or we're like, oh, that's,
yeah.
and the thing is not even as big as a penny, or
Well,
it's a tack size, and yet if it only knew the kind of intimidation that it's hurling your way.
power it has. Yeah,
That's
but growing up, we couldn't even say the word. We called them whats in my house because it was so
right.
great.
That's good. Now, speaking of irrationality, what is something, here's the third one. What is something that you have an irrational obsession with? It's one of those things where you're just obsessed with it and no one else can understand it. It's irrational, but nonetheless.
I don't know that no one else can understand it, but I'm kind of
Okay.
obsessed with tennis. And
Mm,
yeah, so I spend a lot of my free time playing tennis, look for
okay.
lots of opportunities to play tennis. And the friends that I have who are obsessed, I mean, it doesn't matter what's going on, we're there. That's a
Yeah.
boring answer, but that is
No, that's okay. I mean, it's what you love to do, right? So where did that come from? Did you play tennis as a child? Did you grow up playing tennis, or
not.
was it
I know, where it came from was as a new professor at University of Kentucky years ago. I needed an outlet that was not my work. I was too obsessed with my work,
yeah.
and I needed some non-work, non-mom time, and I sort of fell into it. There's a really great tennis community here, um, lots of indoor courts, and so we're able to play all year long. And so I just found a really great group of friends, and it's a wonderful sport, and it's become my social circle as well as my um, as well as my activity, my
Right.
exercise. That's how it happened.
So you pick up, it's hard to pick up a sport when you're an adult. Often, we gravitate as adults to things we were good at when we were children. So can I just ask you a little bit about, you pick up tennis as an adult. How did you take lessons, or did you just keep playing and just improve yourself through playing with the group of friends and connect with that team, or how did that work for you?
Well, actually the kids were taking lessons, and so I so I'd like to take a couple, just to see
Okay.
where it goes. And I'm the one who ended up addicted, and the kids
Okay.
didn't. But yeah, I mean, fortunately, the way that it works with in the U.S. with USTA is you're paired with people who are your same level,
Mm.
and and it's because it wouldn't be very fun if you were brand new and
No.
played against someone who could really whack it. So
Yeah.
you're paired with those people, and then you grow together, and before long you catch up with people who've been doing it for 10 and 15 years.
Right.
It's really kind of neat how that happens. It has
Okay.
been interesting how it's informed my thinking in some ways,
Yeah.
within growth and so forth within schools. But yeah, so that keeps it from being intimidating, because you can play with
Right.
other people who are about your level and so forth.
Right. And
Yeah.
so the U.S. Open 2025, is that what we're talking about here, Leanne? You're going to enter the enter the tournament.
Yeah, if I were even so lucky to buy tickets. That's just,
Right. Yeah. I I haven't played a lot of tennis. The times I have played tennis, I really like it. The problem is I wasn't very good at it and didn't play it frequently enough, and hit a level of frustration with it. Just I don't really live in a climate where there's a lot of indoor tennis, and so your opportunities to play tennis are sporadic. Just in my younger days, but it's a hard sport, and yet you can see the allure of just the and the
yeah. I mean, I don't enjoy running. I run some, but I don't really enjoy it. And it's like
yeah.
for me, when I'm involved in a sport, you kind of forget that you're exercising. So
Right, absolutely. Okay, so Leanne, we're going to finish the way we have always finished every interview, and that is adding in this element of success and happiness, and what that means to you, listeners. You'll recall last week we did a mashup of how all the guests so far have answered the question around success, and so now we're building the next 24 guests to pull together. So as you know, we finish with this question about success and happiness. So my question to you, Leanne, is if a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, what is your definition of success? How would you answer them?
I don't think you can define for any one person what success is. Success is what makes a person, happy and independent. And one of the pieces of success that I've been really interested in lately is the idea of belonging. I mean, I think for most of us to be truly happy and feel successful, we also need a sense of belonging and to feel like we're a part of something and that
Yeah.
we're accepted and that we're valued and that we have worth. And within our field, I think this is an area that we probably need to devote more effort to and more thought to as our role as educators in supporting belonging
Mm-hmm.
of our students. I talk to a lot of parents of kids who have more significant disabilities, sometimes invisible disabilities. And they say, it's one thing for my child to be included. They're in the classroom, they're a part, that's going well, but they're not invited to the birthday party. They're not invited to hang out at the mall. And so while I think there are, ways to meet a somewhat counterfeit definition of success that means, attaining certain types of jobs or a certain level of education, in many ways, none of that matters if we don't also have a sense of belonging. So
Yeah.
to me, I wouldn't say it's the only part of the definition, but belongingness is a piece of success that I'm really interested in right now.
Yeah. It's a really a great point about just how we feel connected to a larger group, a larger picture, and our success is driven by our opportunities to be a part of something bigger than us, and staying connected with that group as well. It's heartbreaking, those stories you hear about, as you say. I'm included in the students are included in the class, but not invited to the birthday parties and not invited to hang out at the mall. It's devastating for a parent, and I can only imagine what that feels like for a parent and a child, for sure. Leanne, thanks so much for being here today. Listeners, you can definitely follow Leanne on Twitter. Her Twitter handle is at Leanne Jung. I'll put the links in the show notes for that. Also, Lead Inclusion on Instagram, at Lead Inclusion. This is a brand new Instagram page. Oh, am I right about that, Leanne?
You're correct. My daughter
Yeah.
is our new social media manager, doing a great
Yeah.
job.
Yeah, and she is doing a great job. That page is. She came out guns a-blazing, that's for sure, with that page. So it's a great follow on Instagram, at Lead Inclusion. As well as the website, www.leadinclusion.org, is where you'll find all kinds of information about Leanne, about associates, about trainings, about workshops, about all publications, lots of great information there. So Leanne, it was great talking to you today. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to next time.
Likewise, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.